Good morning, evening, afternoon, depending on what time of day it is when you are watching this. Today's lesson is going to be on 116, and it's on finding the common denominators or the lowest common denominators. And this lesson is going to go back to when we learned about the least common multiple. So hopefully you remember how to do that, because the least common multiple and the lowest common denominator go hand in hand. Not necessarily the same thing, but basically the same thing. So whenever we're reviewing the least common multiple, say of like 4 and 6, you had to write out each multiple of each one. So it was 4, 8, 12, 16. And where 6, it would have been 6, 12, 18. You find the lowest one they had in common. It's the same thing when we're finding the common denominator. So here you can see it says common denominator. We find common denominators by finding the LCM, the lowest common multiple, of the two denominators and changing the fraction so they each have the same denominator. In order to add, subtract, or compare fractions, we need to have a common denominator. When you're multiplying and dividing fractions, the denominator does not have to be the same. But adding, subtracting, or comparing, they do. So if you do not remember how to find the least or lowest common multiple, you can go back in your notes and review that lesson. So here on the first set of notes on the left, you can see we have two fractions. We have 3/4 and 2/3. To find the common denominator, the lowest common denominator, we need to find the multiples of 4 and 3. So I did that here. We have 4, 8, 12, and 16 are the multiples of 4. The multiples of 3 are 3, 6, 9, 12. So we need to find the smallest number that is the same for both of them. In this case, it is 12. So the smallest number both 3 and 4 have in common is 12. Because then if you look on this page over here, I figured out, okay, if I have to get a denominator of 12, so I need it to be the same, well, looking at 3/4. So if I look right here, and I only look at the 4 part, and I need to make it equal to a fraction that has a denominator of 12, because that's our lowest common denominator. Well, how did I get from 4 to 12? I multiplied it times 3. Now, remember we talked this year about equivalent fractions. Whatever you do to the denominator, you need to do the same to the numerator. So if we multiplied the denominator times 3, we do the same to the numerator. Multiply it times 3, which gives us 9. So now we have to do the same thing with our fraction 2/3. So again, I'm dealing with 2/3 here. Excuse me. But I need to make that also a fraction that has a denominator of 12, because as we found out here, 12 is our lowest common denominator by finding our least common multiple. So to get from 3 to 12, we multiplied times 4. And again, finding the equivalent fraction. You do the same to the denominator and the numerator. So do the exact same thing. So if I multiplied the 3 times 4 to get to 12, I need to multiply the numerator, in this case 2, times 4 to get to 8. So now I have both of these fractions with a common denominator of 12 and 12. So I have 9 twelfths and 8 twelfths. And with that, I can now add them, I can subtract them, and I can compare them by saying which one is largest. So let me erase this page and then go down here. So now, actually, I'm going to come back a little bit. Comparing them, 9 twelfths to 8 twelfths. Which fraction do you think is larger? 3/4 or 2/3? If you said 3/4, you would be correct. Because when we compare them with a common denominator here, the 12 and 12, 9 is larger than 8. So that makes that the larger fraction. If I added them, I would end up with 17 over 12. Because remember, adding, subtracting fractions, you only add or subtract the numerator, the denominator stays the same. So if we go down here, example number 1, it says In one of Katie's cookbooks, a recipe for salsa calls for 3/4 cup of chopped fresh cilantro. A salsa recipe given to Katie by a friend calls for 7/8 cups of fresh cilantro. Which recipe calls for more cilantro? In order to compare fractions, we need to have a common denominator. So we have to compare, as it says right here, compare 3/4 and 7/8 by first finding the lowest common denominator. In order to do that, we have to do this part right here first. We need to find the least common multiple. So we find our multiples of our two denominators, which are, in this case, we have 4 would be 4, 8, 12. Then our denominator of 8, our multiples are 8 and 16. Well, right away I can see, I have a common multiple of 8. So that tells me also the lowest common denominator will be 8. So again, I'm trying to find the smallest number that both denominators go into. In this case, 4 and 8 both go into 8. So sometimes that will happen, where one of your denominators is always the lowest common denominator. So now that I have that, let me erase what I've done so far. So I have the fraction 3/4. I need to get that equal to a fraction that has a denominator of 8, because that's my lowest common denominator. So to get to 8, I have to go 4 times 2. Again, whatever you do to the denominator, you need to do the same to the numerator. So I multiply 4 times 2 to get to 8. I need to multiply the 3 times 2 to get to 6. So now I know I have this is the fraction I'm going to work with. Well, 7/8, I already know my common denominator is going to be 8. So to get from 8 to 8, it's times 1. So I do the same here. 7 times 1 equals 7. So now I have these two fractions. Since they have the same denominator now, I can compare them. So by looking at 6/8 and 7/8, I know that 7/8 is greater because 7 is bigger than 6. So I would have the alligator eating 7/8 because it's the largest fraction. And that's really other than drawing pictures, the only other way you can compare fractions is making sure they have a common denominator, the lowest common denominator. The same is true when we are adding fractions. So if you look over here, I want to add 1/12 and 1/12, 1/2 and 1/4. So I start with looking at the denominators. You always start with the denominators. We need to find that lowest common denominator, the LCD. So 2, my multiples of 2 are 2, 4, and 6. 4, my multiples are 4, 8, and 12. So the smallest one they have in common are 4. So my lowest common denominator is 4. Again, with that LCD, you're finding the smallest number that both denominators will go into. If you find the smallest one it goes into, it'll save you steps at the end when trying to reduce and things like that. Don't forget to reduce fractions. So now I need to find common denominators with each numerator. So I know they both have 4. So if I start with the fraction 1/2, I need to get that to a denominator of 4. So if I take 2 times 2, that gets me to 4. So I need to do the same with my numerator. 1 times 2 equals 2. So 1/2 is equal to 2/4. Now, if I said my lowest common denominator is 4, this already has a 4 in it. So that fraction is not going to change at all. So it ends up being 1/4. Now that I have the same two denominators, I can add my fractions. 2 plus 1 is 3. 4 plus 4. You're right. We don't do 4 plus 4. The denominator just stays the same. But the big thing when adding, subtracting, or comparing fractions, you need to make sure that you have a common denominator, the lowest common denominator. So when we're subtracting fractions, nothing changes. Even if we have mixed numbers, everything is still the same. Forget about the whole number for right now. So we don't need to worry about the 3 and the 1 for right now. So we look at our 1/2 and 1/6. We need to find the lowest common denominator. So what is the smallest number that both 2 and 6 will go into? You can list out the multiples of each one. So for 2, you'd have 2, 4, 6, 8, 12. And 6, your multiples would be 12, 18. But some of you might be able to just figure out in your head, what is the smallest number they both go into? In this case, the smallest number that both the 2 and the 6 go into is 6. So our lowest common denominator is 6. So I need to change this 1/2 to a fraction that has a denominator of 6. So to get from 2 to 6, I multiply it times 3. So I need to do the same with my 1. 1 times 3 equals 3. So now that's my new fraction. Now I can add that whole number back into that mixed number part. And then the same thing with 3 and 1, 6. Well, I already know my lowest common denominator is 6, so I don't need to do anything with that one. It already has that. So I multiply both times 1 and add my 1 back in. Now I can do my subtraction. So we subtract our whole numbers. 3 minus 1 gets me that 2. And now I can do my fractions. 3 minus 1 equals 2. I don't do 6 minus 6, as much as I miss trying to trick you all with that. I do not do that. It just stays the same as 6. Don't forget to reduce. In this case, 2 and 6 are both even numbers, so I know that both are divisible by 2. So I divide it by 2, divide by 2, end up with a reduced fraction of 2 and 1/3. So again, just the big rule is just making sure that you find the lowest common denominator. So you need to find the smallest number that both denominators go into. And then do the same. So like here, the same to both numerator and denominator. If you don't do the same to both, you will not have an equivalent fraction. So again, find the common denominator, adjust the numerators to make sure they create equivalent fractions, and then do your adding, your subtracting, or your comparing. Keep your notes, refer to your notes, and again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to call or send me an email, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Have a great day. Be kind. Bye.